In 1994, Paul Krugman wrote an essay for Foreign Affairs called Competitiveness, a Dangerous Obsession. His main point was really just to question the idea of the concept of competitiveness when applied to countries rather than companies. It's clear what a competitive company is. It's not at all clear, it seems to me, what a competitive country is. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but one of the points he makes in that essay is that a trade surplus may be a sign of national weakness and a deficit a sign of strength. With that in mind, what I want to do, and I'm going to try to be brief so that we have some time for discussion, is to talk about the German economy, and in particular the transformation of the German economy in the 2000s, which transformed, I argue, Germany's previously symbiotic relationship with the rest of the EU. And I want to talk a bit about how that transformation happened and to see it as a geopolitical consequence of the emergence of the post-Cold War world that followed the end of the Cold War. And then finally to say a bit about what I fear that it might mean for the future of Europe. And so I'm going to give a slightly different perspective on the German economy than Bublu did. I'm not sure if I'm contradicting you exactly, but it's slightly different perspective. The initial effect of German reunification in 1990, as in German unification in 1871, was an economic boom. And so in year one after reunification, the German economy grew by 4.5%, particularly the construction industry boomed. But as the surge in demand in the East passed, and uncompetitive factories went out of business, the German economy went into recession. And after having had an almost continuous trade surplus since its creation, the Federal Republic went into deficit. And during the final years of the Kohl government, there was a lot of talk about a reform logjam and Germany as the sick man of Europe. And by the time that Gerhard Schröder took over as Chancellor in 1998, unemployment was at 9%. And it's often said that the reforms that Schröder introduced in his second term in office, especially Agenda 2010, were responsible for this transformation in the German economy that happened during the 2000s. I think that actually much more significant than that, and this is particularly relevant here in the Czech Republic, is the way that production was outsourced to Central and Eastern Europe during that decade. Before German reunification, the German economy had been cut off from economies like the Czech Republic and Poland and Hungary and Slovakia. But at the end of the Cold War suddenly created this arc of low-wage economies with skilled workers on Germany's doorstep. I don't need to tell you any of this because you know this, I'm sure, very, very well. And so what happened was that in the second half of the 2000s, German companies started to relocate production in order to reduce costs and increase competitiveness. And a striking example of that is Audi, which began producing its automobile engines in Hungary, and in the 20 years from 1993 invested 5.7 billion and became the country's biggest foreign direct investor. Now, that type of outsourcing transformed German manufacturing in the way that, that we've just heard, so that actually a lot of German branded goods are no longer actually manufactured in Germany, but merely assembled there. And obviously, the economies of Central Europe, including the Czech Republic, benefited from the investment and training and the creation of jobs that created. It also had the consequence, it seems to me, that much of Central Europe became part of the German supply chain, integrated into what some people have called a greater German economy, that gave Germany an inbuilt advantage relative to other Eurozone economies. And it also aligned to a large extent the economic interests of these countries with those of Germany, and I'm going to come back to that. But this type of outsourcing also had another effect within Germany, which is very important, which was that it put downward pressure on wages for skilled workers within Germany. With unemployment rising, the German trade unions, which had traditionally been thought of as being some of the most powerful in Europe or in the world, agreed to remarkable wage restraint. Wages rose by just 1.1% in Germany in the 2000s. And this led to a drastic drop in unit labour costs at a time when they were increasing elsewhere in the Eurozone. And so you have this gap emerging between Germany and other Eurozone countries. But because this increase in the competitiveness of German firms was due to a fall in unit labour costs rather than productivity growth, which was actually higher in France during that period, actually what you have here is an internal devaluation going on. And as a consequence of that, Germany bucked the trend among developed economies during that period, which saw their share of the world export market decrease. But even as these countries fell behind, German manufacturers managed to maintain their share of the world market and the proportion of manufacturing as a proportion of Germany's GDP as a whole. Now, this is generally seen as being a big success story. In the second half of the 2000s, unemployment fell from its peak of about 11.5%, and the deficit that I mentioned went, a deficit of 1.7% of GDP in 2000 went to a surplus of 7.4% in 2007, in other words, within 7 years, and that's continued at roughly that level since then. However, it seems to me that it had some very problematic consequences. First of all, it increased Germany's dependence on exports. Germany had always been a very export-driven economy. Many of the large German companies and the Mittelstand companies have histories that go back to the 19th century and always exported. However, the contribution of exports to German GDP went from 33% in 2000 to 48% in 2010, which is an extraordinarily high percentage for an economy the size of Germany. And so, in a sense, the German economy became structurally reliant on foreign demand for its growth in a way that it wasn't before. Again, a good microcosm of this is the German automobile industry, which around the time of reunification exported around half of the cars that it produced. By the end of the 2000s, it was exporting more than 3/4 of the cars that it produced. The second problematic consequence, which follows on from that, is that the huge surplus which Germany generated needed to be invested somewhere. So, as Raghuram Rajan, who's now the governor of the Indian Central Bank, put it, it circled the world, this surplus, before finally being invested in property in Ireland and Spain, in subprime in the US. And so what you have is a situation where this surplus produced by wage restraint is recycled into, as one economist put it, oversized exposures to junk foreign securities. At the same time, net investment in Germany was very, very low. The third problematic consequence, which again relates to the other two, is that the German economy is incredibly vulnerable, even though it looks very successful, because it's so dependent on external demand, and therefore extremely vulnerable to external shocks. And we've seen since 2008, and particularly since the Euro crisis began, the consequences of that. During the 2000s, until that happened, Germany essentially got lucky. There was a buoyant global economy, low US interest rates, the creation of the euro produced a credit boom in the Eurozone. It also created imbalances, as we now know, but during the 2000s it created a credit boom from which Germany benefited. And since the euro was weak in relation to the Deutschmark, German exports also were more competitive beyond the Eurozone. In particular in emerging economies such as China above all, where there was also increasing demand as the economies expanded, as the middle class expanded, and you had an almost perfect symbiosis between what the German economy was producing and what those economies needed. So really what happened in the 2000s is you have a German economy at the center of this increasingly integrated Eurozone that goes from having a current account deficit to a current account surplus. But although this is seen as being a triumph, not just in Germany but elsewhere as well, it's being copied now all around Europe. Germans didn't feel they'd benefited from it because of wage restraint, which meant that domestic demand was low, which created a problem. Germany became much more dependent on exports, as I've mentioned, and it created these kind of intolerable pressures within Europe, which have since been exposed. What that means, and this is the argument that I make in the book that Roman mentioned, which comes out at the beginning of December, is that the German question, the classical German question, has re-emerged in geo-economic form. The classical German question, in other words, between 1871, after the unification of Germany, and 1945, was the problem created by a Germany at the center of Europe, which was too powerful for a balance of power, but too weak, too small actually, for hegemony. That question appeared to have been resolved after World War II by the division of Germany and by the integration of the Federal Republic into the West through NATO and the EU. With the transformation of Europe at the end of the Cold War, Germany returned in a sense to the old Mittellager, the central position in Europe that it used to have. But whereas in the past it had been surrounded by enemies, potential enemies on all sides, it was now surrounded by friends, encircled by friends, as a German politician put it. And so in geopolitical terms, Germany was and remains benign. There's no danger of war within Europe, as there used to be. However, the size of the German economy and the interdependence between it and other Eurozone economies in particular, it seems to me is creating instability within Europe now in a somewhat analogous way to the way that Germany used to. And so, as I say, what seems to have happened is that the German question has re-emerged in geoeconomic form. The danger, I think, that creates is a kind of geo-economic version of the type of conflicts that followed German reunification in 1871. And in particular, what I mean by that is a return to the competitive dynamic of coalition building among the great powers in Europe before 1945. Since the euro crisis began, there's been this very interesting dynamic going on, which is centered on Germany as member states within the EU have adopted a kind of a mixture of what international relations theorists would call bandwagoning on the one hand and counterbalancing on the other hand. And so it seems to me that the sort of network structure, the sort of network relational structure that you used to have within the EU is being replaced to some extent by a kind of a hub and spoke model which centers on Germany. On the one hand, as I say, some countries are bandwagoning with Germany, and in particular, the countries of Central Europe, the Visegrad Four, whose economies have been so integrated into Germany's since the end of the Cold War, it seems to me are beginning to form a kind of a geo-economic equivalent of a German sphere of influence. Some analysts have talked about the re-emergence of a German-dominated Mitteleuropa. At the same time, you have other EU member states, particularly those that we now call the periphery, which I think is an extremely problematic term because it's essentially a term that refers not to geography but to imperial structures. The member states of the so-called periphery have found themselves under increasing pressure to form a kind of a common front, as George Soros put it, against Germany. So I think what's happened is the geopolitical dilemmas that Europe struggled with for centuries have kind of re-emerged in geoeconomic form, particularly centered on this conflict within the Eurozone between the interests of creditor states and debtor states. Creditor states tend to be in the minority in debt crises. If you look at the history of debt crises, creditor countries tend to be in the minority, but they coordinate very effectively. On the other hand, debtor countries tend to be more numerous, but they face much greater problems of collective action because they have an interest in differentiating themselves from each other, and you see that very clearly within the Eurozone, where everybody tries to differentiate themselves from Greece, and France tries to differentiates itself from Italy, and so on. I think in this case a lot is going to depend on France, which has so far held back from the idea of forming this kind of anti-coalition, although there have been a couple of moments when it seemed to be a possibility, particularly in 2012. The breakthrough that produced OMT was actually produced by a French, Spanish, Italian coalition against Germany. And so I think the rather worrying question that I ask myself is how much conflict is needed within Europe in order to resolve this dynamic.